I want to introduce my panelists before I give a very brief introduction. So, to my left hand, there's Sebastian de Line. He's a queer trans artist and scholar of the Haudenosaunee Métis Asian descent. And he's currently working on a PhD in cultural studies at Queen's University. And his dissertation, Postmodern Economies in Art, the necropolitics of value in indigenized and racialized production, investigates the manufacturing of economies, which instill objects into museum collection produced by systems of colonial property production that generate value through a necropolitical capitalization upon states of unliving. So I think everyone who is interested in these topics can very much look forward to your book and to your dissertation. And it certainly addresses a lot of topics which are at the core of the question of cultural appropriation, especially when we turn to museum cultures. To my right hand is Paulo Tavares. He is an architect based in Brazil. And his design and pedagogic practice spans different territories, social geographies, and media. He created the agency Autonoma in 2017, a platform dedicated to urban research and intervention. Paulo Tavares is also a long-term collaborator of forensic architecture and a co-curator of the 2019 Chicago Architectural Biennial. So these are my panelists. Now briefly, so we will have one announcement because Kader Attia, who was planned to be here and to discuss with us, unfortunately cannot come. But we will show a short excerpt of his film at the very beginning, because this film certainly addresses also a lot of questions which are important to the panel, and hopefully give us also some common material to which we can refer to in the panel discussion. So why appropriation? I mean, the question is evident when you have seen the exhibition. And I think I hope, but I'm sure we will address the more interesting questions of appropriation. The most uninteresting, I think, is either like saying, it's good or bad. On the one hand, if we say no appropriation, then we are stuck in a kind of anti-historicist essentialisms. And when we say appropriation, there's nothing but appropriation. We are in a kind of Baudrillard-like sign exchange system, which is totally linked to capitalism. So I think there is a lot more in between. And usually the histories are much more complicated and entangled and also more interesting. But I think two aspects are very relevant in this, in the question of appropriation. Well, first of all, and certainly the power positions. So who is appropriating whom, from which perspective, is this possible or not? Does this lead to a form of exchange on the basis of equality or not? So I think this is a crucial question, is the power relation, like as anywhere in society. Okay, the second question is, which is already in the term, appropriation, so the notion of property. So to whom does something belong? Do we talk about property? Do we talk about ownership? Do we talk about belonging, as Sebastian talks about in the Bauhaus Imaginista website article or like interview he's giving? So this is a crucial question I think we also have to address when we talk about appropriation. Are there different forms which are not defined within the Western notion of property, which is protected by law, which is basically protecting private property? Since 10 years, I would say, which is kind of good news, we have an explosion of scholarship who is talking about appropriation and investigating all these complicated histories, like entangled histories. But what definitely has not changed is something what Rastum Barucha just has mentioned on the previous panel, namely that the worldviews, and I just quote from the panel, the worldviews and ecological wisdom of First Nations and indigenous people and communities has never been taken into account into the imaginaries of the nation state. And I think this is a very important point, because when we ask about cultural appropriation today and what can be done, and if can we escape the relations which have been cultivated over more than 100 years now, starting from colonialism, about where all these objects have been brought to Europe, have been made available for artistic production, have been served as bare material or pure material for artistic invention and intervention. So how can we change these relations today? So, and this definitely means to bring in different perspectives, to bring in different property relations, to bring different relations in general back to the core. So this is also certainly, maybe I leave it here, because now this brings us back to the questions of objects, and Kader Attia's film, which you can also see in the exhibition, which is 1 hour long. Kader chose an excerpt of 10 minutes, and the whole film is about the questions of objects. So we start with the film before then Paulo and then Sebastian will give presentations, or better, I will engage in conversations with them. So, okay, we can, I think.
What they did was take a part of our history away from us, right? See, they took so much of our identity away, or tried to take so much of our identity away, and those things were a part of it. Not only our language and cultures, but things that represented our art, our culture, and also represented spirituality to us in some instances. So it's very important that we have those back, because not only is it part of reconciliation, but it's a part of who we were.
Quand le parti est arrivé au royaume du Congo, un grand succès, c'est convertir le roi. Il a eu même un enfant du roi qui est devenu le premier évêque noir. C'est une histoire très intéressante. Donc, et qui a été représenté au Vatican, à Rome. Donc, les Portugais ont converti le royaume, le roi, pas tous les gens, le roi, ça a donné une cause de beaucoup d'esclaves qui refusaient de se convertir au christianisme. Donc, c'était une religion totalitaire, comme à mon avis, toutes les religions. Alors, quand le roi s'est converti, les missionnaires qui étaient avec Capucin ont demandé de réunir tous les idoles sur une place et brûler. Et le roi a accepté. Donc, ces idoles ont échappé au sol plus tard.
Le progrès a été apporté en Afrique. Il n'y a pas toujours eu ces grandes violences, mais il est certain que effectivement le fameux tracé du train Congo-Océan, on comptait. De même, par exemple, que quand on parle de certains champs de bataille de la guerre de 14, on dit il y a eu tant de morts au mètre carré, hein, de Haut-Mont. Hein. Pour le Congo-Océan, on dit il y a eu tant de morts par traverse. Donc c'est des centaines de victimes, sinon des milliers. Là, effectivement, on se pose la question, est-ce que le progrès apporté valait tant de vie humaine? Et en plus, souvent, on remarque quand même que c'était des chemins de fer à but commercial. C'était pas du tout pour apporter de la quinine au fin fond des forêts, c'était pour sortir le bois ou d'autres choses comme ça. Donc, c'était vraiment de l'exploitation et avec un prix du sang absolument énorme.
Colonization has been through basically since the day they extended their hand and said hello. My people, as you know, have been subject to residential schools where they took our children away from their parents and made them live in a room where they couldn't speak their own language. They had to cut their hair. They had to all dress alike. Thousands of our children died or were buried in mass graves. There's still stories of our children who ran away, dying trying to go home. You know, there's that type of history. There's the fact that there are more children in care today in children's aid than were throughout history. There's the day schools where they also force children to go to these schools during the day, and they suffered abuses, both all sexual, physical, mental, spiritual. There has been, even when you talked about the soldiers who went to war and came back, well, when they came back, they had to watch their brothers and sisters in arms who were non-indigenous come back to a little plot of land or some money. Well, they came back to nothing. They were not giving these things. So as recently as 5 years ago, and there's not very many, if any, left, World War I and World War II veterans were talking about, why has this happened to us? We deserve what was given to them. We're not jealous, but this is something we deserve. We fought, we bled, we died. We deserve this too. And so I don't even know if they lived long enough to see it, but I know they were still fighting for it 5 years ago. So the idea of colonization, what it has done to our people, generationally up till the day, has been traumatic to say the least. It has converted some of our people into Canadian society through processes, through elimination of practices and cultures, has forced some of our society into not understanding where they fit anymore, so they feel lost and vulnerable. So we have systems that have taken us out of who we are and who've damaged us. And no, that's the word, they've damaged us. They have not beaten us.
The story goes back to the year 1965, when I was doing my first research in eastern Angola, southeastern Angola, which the Portuguese used to call o fim do mundo, the end of the world. I was the first ethnologist there who was doing a study of the traditional institutions. One day I heard news that a traditional healer of the Chokwe people was in trouble, that he was imprisoned. And I went to the administration to find out what has happened and whether perhaps I could help. It turned out that the traditional healer was accused of witchcraft, because for the Portuguese, everything was feiticeria, everything was witchcraft. They couldn't distinguish between a wizard and a witch, a sorcerer, and a traditional healer. And I was shown by the administrator in the small town of Longa, where the person was kept in prison. I was showing the objects which they had taken from him, claiming that this was a terrible witchcraft objects. I examined their objects, and I knew, of course, that they were things that I generally used, very beautiful carvings and so on, generally used by traditional healers in their healing practice, not in order to bewitch or to threaten anyone.
Well, I think protecting them from outsiders trying to exploit them has been certainly one thing that people have had to do. First of all, they had to protect themselves from the law. So when these things were banned and outlawed, people had to go into hiding to practice them because they could be arrested, or jailed, and prosecuted as a result of practicing those things. So they had to go underground.
And in the end, what it turned out, we made a deal. You see, as he said, there was a chance that he could be liberated, he could be free again, but the objects would have to be destroyed. I said, now, these are very important ethnographic objects. We do the following, you see, I can guarantee that this person doesn't harm anyone. He's a traditional healer, he should go on with his practice. If the objects have been confiscated and will not be returned to him, which would be normal, then the next best solution is that we send the objects to a museum, but under the condition that he becomes free. And that deal was done, you see.
Adorcisme, ça veut dire que est à donner un caïman en esprit d'un ancêtre que veut qu'il devienne divin. Alors, il est un praticien, il commence, un jour il fait son première intervention sur le contrôle du maître, Et à partir de ce moment, il sera plus ou moins renommé d'après les consultations qu'il a. Mais disons que le divin parle avec un support d'une force possession d'âme d'ancêtre. Donc, elle lui donne une autorité qui lui accepte, et les gens qu'il consulte acceptent aussi. Donc, ce n'est pas une improvisation, quelqu'un qui sait parce qu'il connaît des choses, mais il connaît, mais en même temps, il est possédé par une force positive, donc qu'il ne va pas exorciser, mais il va accueillir. Il y a une espèce de mariage alors entre lui et le panier divinatoire.
So if we had had somebody practicing part of their spirituality and their history and culture and stuff, maybe 25 years ago or 20 years ago, there would have been a lot of people in our own community who would have said, that's witchcraft. So something that the churches and stuff brought to us back in the day, that's witchcraft, that's not learning, that's pagan. You can't do that, here's what you do in church. That mentality stayed with some of the people, and so that when their own people were practicing what they truly believed in, it was seen as, that's witchcraft. But that's transition now, so it's changing. I mean, there are still those who believe in the church and stuff, but they accept the fact that the spirituality and the cultural practice of our people is a good thing.
We have Indigenous health centers in this province that work with both. They bring in elders or traditional healers who have their own particular knowledge that comes from spirit, from working with plant medicine, from certain types of practices that they've evolved over their careers, working with Western medical and clinical practitioners. And so I think that there is room for both, and that we're finding ways for those things to work together, because I think we can take the best from both of those worlds to be able to apply to improving health among Indigenous populations and possibly other populations. But I think Indigenous healing methods for the time being need to be for Indigenous peoples, because we're still trying to recover and recuperate those things ourselves.
Yeah, so thanks, Kader, wherever you are, for this excerpt. And I think just to maybe summarize like some points which will be very crucial for our debate. So in the film, we talk about, first of all, the problem of classification. So witchcraft, wizard, healer, sorcerer, like which terms do we use? When we deal with also the question of cultural appropriation, then a very important question, the question of spirituality and healing, which is certainly a big topic for Kader, but also for you, Sebastian, which is obviously often something which has not been appropriated, because it, like, if we retell the story of modernism, had to be rejected because of because it didn't contradicted any notion which are reconcilable with the idea of enlightenment, because they're just we call it superstition. And then certainly we have the question of knowledge. So when we talk about the museum, which knowledge is produced and for whom? And then we have certainly the question of internal colonization. For example, when they talk about Canada and the First Nations, and I think this is something which I hand over now to Sebastian. To Paulo, because he is talking about a very interesting case about like internal colonization and how the best intentions not go wrong, but are trapped in a much bigger historical picture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I have to start saying that for me, it's very difficult to think the idea of culture without appropriation, if we don't want to employ a very specific definition of culture as insulated, isolated, contained entities, which is in fact an artificial definition that we inherit from Western ethnography, from modern colonial ethnography. So somehow the title of the panel sounds a bit awkward, how to redress cultural appropriation. I think that in fact we are talking about a very specific mode of cultural appropriation, which is foundational to modern Western culture and to modernism as such, which should be called expropriation, not appropriation. So expropriation happens when cultural appropriation turns into a means of exercising power, of subjugating, of marginalizing. With expropriation comes exclusion, exception, expulsion. It's a mode of appropriation that implies the destruction, the killing of that which is appropriated, even if this form of destruction is conducted in the name of preservation, of musification, of the reification of culture as objects, symbols, and images. So that's a brief sort of introduction to the project that I would like to share with you here, that I made in response to the project Bauhaus Imaginista. And I want to share with you in a very informal way. I'm not going to read a paper or anything, it's just to really go through the project. This project is called Dishabitat. So it's addressed or engaged with a magazine called Habitat that was edited by architect Lina Bobardi in Brazil in the 50s and 60s. And Habitat, as many magazines that we saw here, was a sort of militant modernist magazine that was trying to teach the urban elites of Brazil, what was a modern habitat, what was a modern aesthetics, how you should engage with a different type of sensibility, and often using a very pedagogical language to teach those urban elites in how they should dress or what kind of objects they should have in their house, so on and so forth. Now, one aspect that it's important in the magazine and that I was very attracted to since very early on is that many indigenous objects and images of indigenous objects would appear in that magazine. So in the sense that they were trying to teach those urban elites that to be modern was not only to be connected with, the avant-garde of Europe, but also with vernacular, indigenous, folks, popular modes of cultural expression. Right, so there was this question that, as we know, is part of the very constituency or constitution of modernism as such, but in Brazil, likewise in other countries of Latin America, those objects enter as a symbol of modernity, but also as a symbol of particular type of modernity. It was national modernity, right? So there's a famous phrase by one of Brazilian modernists saying, here in Brazil, the indigenous element is real. Right, because at this time the majority of the Brazilian territory was in fact populated by indigenous groups and nations, and often it comes in a form of comparison, in parallel with modern paintings or modern objects, and trying to make this kind of relationship not only on the textual level but also on the graphic level. It's also important to mention that Habitat was part of a larger public or pedagogic program that was created inside the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo that was founded in 1947 by Pietro Maria Bardi, and that Lina Bobardi was one of the protagonists of the creation of this museum. And what I'm calling this sort of pedagogic program of the museum involved a series of exhibitions that were called didactic exhibitions on art history that Lina herself designed, both the displays as well as those panels that you can see here through several sort of collages, while through which she was trying to form a public around the history of modern art or the history of art itself, again, trying to teach or to form this public in a kind of modern sensibility. And Habitat was, of course, a kind of extension of this project. And you can really see here in this cover, which was designed by Lina, an indigenous object, the image of a forest, sort of expressing the idea of the tropical in connection to a window of a modern building. So the way in which those objects appear in Habitat were very much detached from their context, right? They appear as a sort of isolated entities, as if they were in between an ethnographic and a modern museum. And the question that we ask, okay, so, you know, where does this objects came from? It's a very simple question, right? How is it possible that those objects would appear in a magazine such as Habitat? What is the circuits? What are the networks that allow them to, you know, emerge in these magazines as signifiers of modernity? So we did what I like to call a kind of archaeology of Habitat, an excavation of Habitat, and trying to really identify those objects, because throughout the 15 years of the publication of the magazine, several articles on indigenous objects and arts and crafts and also rituals appear. So we are really trying to excavate and understand where those objects came from, identifying that's not a very easy task. So in 1910, the Brazilian government created an agency which was called the Service for the Protection of the Indian, because it was a moment of frontier expansion, of nation building, and nation building was connected to this idea of the conquest of the frontier in Brazil. And of course, although the government would claim that those spaces were what they call demographic voids, they were in fact populated by, you know, many different indigenous nations. So they need to come with a sort of solution for those nations, and they invented this institution called the Service for the Protection of the Indian that was in charge of applying what was then officially known as the pacification of indigenous groups. So basically what they were doing is like establishing outposts throughout the country, and they use a kind of colonial strategy, which we call reducciones or decimentos, which imply that you would concentrate those populations in those outposts and somehow try to transform them into national citizens. And one of the methodologies that they used was to exchange objects, right? They would bring several sort of Western objects and bring to those groups. Here is the group of Central Brazil, the Cuicuro, and one of the images of this process of pacification, of trying to, what they call, making contact with them. Now, by 1950, when Habitat started to be published, there was over 100 outposts controlled by the Service of the Protection of the Indian. And those outposts were organized according to levels of acculturation, if you want to say. So they were called posts of education, frontier posts, posts of medical care, so different stages of integration of those indigenous groups. And of course, that they open up those lands for a series of photographers, filmmakers, ethnographers to have access to those areas and to really record images of those areas. What is particularly interesting in that aspect is that in 1942, the Service of the Protection of the Indians created a different sort of attached bureau called the Section of Studies that were in charge of documenting and collecting objects of those groups that were being pacified, right? So in this Section of Studies employed several filmmakers and photographers that would be considered pioneers of Brazilian modernism. So in the exhibition you can see a film by Hans Forthman that was one of the pioneer filmmakers of modernism in Brazil, and he was engaged in this sort of quote-unquote ethnographic activity. And here that image is very important for me because it shows a kind of display or exhibition of the ceramic objects of the Carajá people, which were in fact one of the groups that feature most in Habitat because their ceramic is very sculptural, so it could be easily compared to modernist avant-garde art, and that's precisely what happened. So that's Project Habitat, and it's called Deshabitat, because while this modernist habitat was being forged or communicated, of course, there was a process of desterritorialization, dispossession, this habitat that was implicated in the process of constructing this modern habitat. So the project takes the form of a magazine. It's a kind of facsimile magazine. So it's almost trying to reverse the logic of appropriation, as if I am appropriating Lina Bobard itself and the means by which she could engage in this militant modernist pedagogic activity. And I'm just going to run through some of the pages of the project. As you can see, we kind of employ a mechanism that she herself used a lot, which is trying to do these associations between images through collages and sort of placement one next to the other. And that's the procedure that we use throughout the project. For example, here, what we did is that we investigated 6 or 7 archives in Brazil that somehow tell the history of what is outside the frame of habitat, right? So while these objects were portrayed as detached from their territory, isolated entities, as if they were in a museum, there were several other archives, one of each is the section of studies of the Service for the Protection of the Indians that in fact show the colonial context from which they emerged. And we try to narrate that history by those interventions, as well as by writing a text that explain those colonial histories that are behind that mode of expropriation, appropriation. And I'm just going to tell you one history that appears in the project. So while modernists, artists and painters and writers were interested in the indigenous, there was a problem with architecture because architecture, they did not find any sort of, let's say, substantial material or archaeological resource as, for example, the Spanish America would have found, like Mexico, for example, where you had like large empires and then you have like large constructions made of stone. That's because Brazil is the lowlands of Latin America, so people were, let's say, building their houses and their cities and their regions with the various materials of the forest that tend to be consumed by the forest itself. So one way of finding this identity, this national identity that would inform modern language was by looking to the Baroque that was produced during colonization, that was also in the interior of the country. So the architecture, specifically in the field of architecture, what informed the modern language in Brazil was not so much the indigenous, but more the Baroque, the colonial architecture of the frontier, if you'd like to put it this way. And this idea of the relationship between the modern and the Baroque, which the modern and the colonial, was celebrated and consolidated in an exhibition organized at MoMA that was called Brazil Builds, and you can see the cover of the catalog here, where you see the image of a Baroque sculpture done by one of the most important Baroque artists in Brazil, called Aleijadinho, and I stared by modernist architect Niemeyer make this kind of relationship that the Brazilian tradition of modern architecture had a kind of filiation to what was then called the colonial tradition. And here's the exhibition at MoMA. They dedicate, you know, a large part of the exhibition to the investigation of colonial architecture. Most interestingly, in that respect, is the history of the capital of Brazil, done by modern architect and urban planner Lúcio Costa and architect Oscar Niemeyer, which is Brasília. That's the plan of Brasília that everyone associates with an airplane, right? So something that's going towards progress. But in fact, it is the form of a cross, as Lúcio Costa would say. And he has a very interesting phrase in the way he describes the city. He says, the city, Brasília, was born out of the gesture of one who takes possession of a land. It's a kind of reenactment of the colonial tradition. And this is something that has been voiced by different, let's say, modern critiques and modern artists throughout. And particularly interesting is the way in which when Brasília was being created, before it was created, to demarcate the possession of the site, they decided to do a Catholic Mass in the construction site. And this, what you see on the top, is a kind of chapel designed by modernist architect Oscar Niemeyer, where they celebrate this Catholic Mass. And at this time, the president of the country, Juscelino Kubitschek, ordered the Brazilian Air Force to bring a delegation of Carajá people, indigenous people, to be part of this Mass so that they could reenact the first Mass celebrated by the Portuguese when they arrived in Brazil. That was a kind of tradition of the Portuguese colonizers. They would arrive to a land and celebrate a Catholic Mass to demarcate the possession of the colony, but more precisely the way that this image has been immortalized in late 19th century by Victor Meirelles. And here's one of the images of the indigenous groups. Okay, so there's other little stories of modern and coloniality, which I will not tell you right now, but I just want to end with something else to, let's say, bring us back to the present and the future. I work as an artist sometimes, but I work more as a kind of advocate. And I want to finish this talk by presenting you a human rights report that we are doing in relation to the expulsion of indigenous populations from Amazonia in Ecuador due to the opening of a large copper mine by Chinese capital. This report is called Expulsion. And what happens is that all those land has been enclosed. What you see is a sign saying private property, so that this big mine can be open. Here you see a satellite image of the area where they lived before the mine, and here below you see an image of the mine being open. So you can see the amount of destruction that has happened to this land. And here's a map that we are helping them in a lawsuit to locate the families that have been displaced. So those red triangles are different families and communities that have been displaced for this mine to be open. And what they did is that they went to those houses, kicked the people out, and they burned their own houses in the dirt, right, with machines, right? So here you will see Rodrigo Vélez on the top of the ruins of his house, which is now property of the mine. And while we were doing this research, while we were in the field, we met with José Tendeza, and we were in his house, and he showed us that object, that vase, that he's from the Shuar people, and he just found that vase in his backyard. And based on that, we start to look to the reports that have to be conducted for you to open a mine, the environmental assessment reports, which are very difficult to read because they're like 1,000 pages long, right, and involve like many sort of scientific studies. But we identified that, in fact, they conducted several archaeological excavations in this area, and they found sort of remarkable pieces in the site. So we start to map all those excavations that the company has done, and what we realize is that the whole site is a huge archaeological complex. All those dots that you see is what is called terrazas, which is a kind of interventions in the terrain, so they could grow their own architecture, their own agriculture, right? So these are kind of interventions in the landscape, and in which of those sites you would find those objects. So I guess I'll leave it here and to bring this habitat into the contemporary. And we know that these modes of expropriation of objects, objects that we see in the museum, that we see in the exhibition, are not a thing from the past, right? We have seen wars being waged in the way that those wars allow a continuous process of expropriation, which is also a process of expulsion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, your whole talk or presentation was a very impressive example of how what you said in the beginning, destruction is done in the name of preservation, and I think this is a very crucial term for every every question, any question when we deal with the question of objects and museums. I would like to turn to Sebastian. Sebastian, I mean, you maybe you could say something a little bit about the question of the object. Because, I mean, this is a very highly problematic notion. As we all know, we are very, very familiar with it. We continuously talk about objects, but most of you are also familiar with the fact that a lot of what we call objects are subjects in different, I don't want to say cultures because it's culturalizing, societies. Yeah, so maybe you could say something a little bit also about the question of destruction in the name of preservation and the question of objects, how you encounter it as well in your artistic practice, but also like in your research, when you talk about research also about the value question, which is very much linked to the object question.
Okay. Can you hear me? I think part of the challenge of when we get to the topic of translation, and I mean English is my first language too. I'm a language learner in Ganigahaga, so I'm not going to try to speak Ganigahaga with you, and I don't think many of you would understand anyway. So part of the difficulty in even when we address this kind of subject matter in terms of understanding the philosophy or different philosophies from our different nations and in different indigenous nations, that is primarily focused around relations and relationality. That we don't have this way of having a schism between subject and object. And so that's already one very large difference in terms of the translation of in the format of exhibitions when it comes to how we situate ourselves in relation to that we encounter, right? So part of that, different people I've spoken with and different literature that I've read from other indigenous scholars would say different things. But some people might translate the word artifact or object as our relatives, and some people would say the ancient ones. Some people would say ancestors, you know. It comes to a conversation I had in learning from in a segment in New York. I was there also together with various colleagues, including curator Candace Hopkins. And Candace and I were visiting one of the exhibitions in the Natural History Museum. And we came upon the topic of some people using, trying to play around a little bit with the language and deconstruct that idea of, okay, well, what else could we say? What would be less problematic? And of course, there are always other problematic things that you find as you go on, and the more that you learn, and the unlearning. So it's a bit of this learning and unlearning simultaneously, right? And so she had proposed in that moment, well, we could also say belongings, because there's a one intonation, right, or one kind of translation of the word belonging insinuates a kind of sense of care. Okay, well, so if you belong somewhere, you are part of something else larger than yourself. But belonging also has a history, which is something that you were addressing earlier, that I wrote about in the reflection. That other scholarship, like say Che Gossett is a scholar that I'm very fond of, who's an American Black trans scholar, and they oftentimes refer to the problematics of belonging in terms of property, right? Having belonged to whom, right? And so as enslaved and indigenous and indentured folk have been property, having belonged. So that is also a challenging word and not necessarily the best.
May I just ask a question? Because maybe, or I don't know the etymology and also not the history of the term or the history of the notion of belonging. When you say it's mixed now with the notion of property, is this like also inscribing the question of belonging into like our legal system and our understanding? Because we cannot think of belonging other than property, or I don't know, is there a certain history, or you say you can take the two notions apart or not? anymore?
It would be difficult. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot. I can only speculate. I'm an artist who studies cultural studies, but I think one of the challenges, at least in Turtle Island, or what some people call North America, in Canadian law example, would be based on case law and precedent, and I'm not sure if that's the case here. But in the United States, it would be, I think, as well. The problematics of that with case law and precedent is that then language, there's a very difficult challenge in bringing in a different translation or a language that hasn't already been set in a precedent. And so then whatever has been defined, and there are gray areas between that, obviously the law is interpreted in that way. So there would probably be space within arguing the usefulness and the non-usefulness of the word belonging. But a larger subject, let's say that what it doesn't really speak to is more about the philosophical framing of being in relation. And so part of it has more to do with, if we come from the premise that that everything is alive, everything is animate, which is very much a kind of basic tenet of a lot of indigenous ways of knowing. And that is, when I say ways of knowing, we say that in terms of a more holistic way of not having a separation between epistemology, ontologies, and sciences, and et cetera, but it's much more holistic in that way. Through relationality, everything through relationality. In that sense, like example, Leroy Littlebear is a very good scholar that is Blackfoot that I like very much. And he talks a lot about, he would say that everything is alive, everything is in relation, everything is in constant flux. And how he relates that in terms of Blackfoot science, he would say that he would frame it as constant flux being energy waves. And energy waves, which would be sound, light, water, moves in that way. Electricity, this energy waves is also what we might refer to as creator or spirit. So you could the language around that was always been there, but maybe we have different ways that we're relearning our languages and trying to discover. Not discover is such a bad word. Forget I said that. Sorry. That we have to relearn our philosophies too by grounding it in understanding our own ways of knowing, and understanding that also is coupled with language.
It's coupled with language, but this also is, I think, what you addressed earlier. It's important to think about the question of translation, or as the one scholar in Kader Attia's film said, we need to take the best of two worlds. But I think at some point, maybe these two worlds also contradict each other. Or, I mean, you were showing a very good example of the, that's not only appropriation, but expropriation. So what we have in the museums is not necessarily, it contradicts probably what you would expect, what an object or like a relative is. And my question is whether you have encountered also like a conflict which is not resolvable between, let's say, artistic practice, working in the museum, and what you know from like indigenous knowledge, because the museum is very much entangled also into history of,
I mean, I think different and contemporary indigenous artists and scholars have ways that, that people work within the structures of a white cube or a museum institution with those problematics. So that's not, sometimes that can be fruitful as a place of contention, and a place of working through some of those issues and bringing that to light. But I think it was interesting, like one of the covers that you had shared with, I think it was number 7 Habitat. I really liked this composition of the images, and what it reminded me of too is there was the image on the bottom left that with the window, and it was it was a guarded window, right? And so it was interesting because it reminded me of this question of carcerality, in terms of if we think of it and frame it as our relatives, ancestors. Ancient ones are in museums and are being collected and housed in museums. and they are alive. And if we are establishing, having a discussion now about vitality, right? In that sense, what does that actually imply? And it's not the same. I don't want to conflate exactly the same. It's not the same as incarceration of living human persons right now, right? But these systems, there is something intertwined in that system of property and ownership. And I think and this is what you're talking about, or how I understand you to talk about that. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which brings me maybe also when you say there are artists who have found methods how to work, indigenous contemporary artists, how to work in museums. And I think maybe this is something we already have left, because I think still until 5 years ago, especially in a Western context, the notion of self-ethnographizing or self-folklorizing was kind of the biggest danger, which was a trap which we have absolutely to avoid, and probably still at that time one could not see that this is a different way of thinking, and as the first thing you have to do is to respect and not to like, oh, you cannot do it, it's self-folklorizing. But anyway, so this is a different question. But when Paulo, you have also shown like a method, which you call methodology, like showing what has been left out of the frame by Lina Bobardi, and then forensic architecture and the question of archaeology as a method. So I would like to talk a little bit about methods, how to escape the traps of appropriation and expropriation. But yeah, also maybe Sebastian, you can start, because we have talked about like earlier about different methodologies, and you have some propositions for us, and you brought also some footnotes. So maybe, yeah.
Do you want me to start with setting up the notes? Okay. I might shift over to that side. I'm going to read you a series of citations as a way of bringing in other scholars and voices that aren't here right now, and in thinking together as scholars and artists and researchers in terms of broadening our learning. So these are indigenous scholars primarily from what we call North America, or Turtle Island, that I'm very interested in, and I imagine that most of you are unfamiliar with them. So I'm going to read some helpful quotations in thinking through what people talk about in terms of what is a method of refusal. So the aim of proposing a living syllabus, which is I propose to everyone here, is to invite you as researchers affiliated with this Bauhaus Imaginista project to actively participate in relational pedagogies that are grounded in an ethics of reciprocity. So I want you to try to imagine now thinking about refusal, but thinking about refusal and reciprocity together, not as refusal that takes you down a certain kind of road that is completely solitary or exclusive, but always thinking through what are the impacts of relationality and an ethic of that. So by exchanging methods of ethical consideration, we take on responsibilities of embodying ethical pedagogies which serve to inform our artistic, curatorial, and art histories, I say, in place of histories or herstories, historical praxes. So what are methods of ethical refusal? I begin by focusing on two key texts that define refusal, or whose scholarship emphasizes ethnographic refusal or decolonial approaches. This short syllabus is composed of only indigenous single and primary authors, so there are also some co-authored texts. Begin with Audra Simpson. In 2007, Audra Simpson, who is a Kanien'kehá:ka, or some of you might be more familiar with the name Mohawk, is a cultural anthropologist at Columbia University. And she wrote a very well-known book that's called Mohawk Interruptus. And this is an essay in Juncture's journal. There was a starting point for a lot of indigenous scholars in North America right now who are thinking through refusal. And she frames it as the ethnographic refusal. Her research was focusing on her own nation, in Kahnawake, and questions of membership, citizenship, within the nation, and that what the fraughtness that brings up in terms of questions of belonging that have come through the nation-state Canadian interventions with status, the challenges of what we would governmentally is framed as status. So status and non-status, who is then through a Canadian legal system excluded from one's own nation and one's own access to community. And it gets really complicated. But anyway, so she conducted research where she interviewed her own community. And some of the stories that were shared with her are stories that came up in terms of, within the interview, refusals, where there was a lot of what was unsaid, but that was known by everyone there. And so she shares a story about one of her interviewees who is talking about not the problematics of being included on a certain list of membership or not, and how that person would say, well, nobody knows who has this list. Nobody knows who, and actually everyone does, but there is a certain by bringing it into scholarship, by bringing it into academic research, it has another implication of then she asked the question, can I do this research and still come home? You know? So, while thinking, does that undermine sovereignty within my own nation, right? So from that, in 2014, Eve Tuck and Wang Yang build upon the work of Audra Simpson when they wrote this article called Our Words Refusing Research. And their work this essay is particularly, it's situated in social science, but it's very fruitful in terms of other disciplines and other interdisciplinary kind of thinking. Where they build upon her work in talking about how the problematic of focusing oftentimes on pain narratives and how that becomes quite commodified and fetishized within the academia. And so their action, in a way, their call to refusal, is to think through knowledge and how knowledge, we have a kind of liberalized, neoliberal idea that all knowledge is something that should be accessible to all of us. And that's why. Why is that the case? Why do as Western thinking, do we believe that all knowledge is something that can be acquired? And so what they do is they work within this idea of refusal. So the starting point of a method of ethnographic refusal began with Kanien'kehá:ka cultural anthropologist Audra Simpson, as we know. She says, "What am I revealing here and why? Where will this get us? Who benefits from this and why? And enough was when they shut down or told me to turn off the recorder." Yahweh. Okay. The ethnographic limit then was reached not just when it would cause harm or extreme discomfort. The limit was arrived at when the representation would bite all of us and compromise the representational territory that we have gained for ourselves. So and now I turn to Tuck and Yang and they say, refusal and stances of refusal in research are attempts to place limits on conquest and the colonization of knowledge by marking what is off limits, what is not up for grabs or discussion, what is sacred, and what can't be known. They go on to say that pain and humiliation are part of the collective wisdom that often informs the writings of researchers who attempt to position their intellectual work as decolonization. How do we learn from and respect the wisdom and desires in the stories that we overhear while refusing to portray/betray them to the spectacle of the settler colonial gaze? How do we develop an ethics for research that differentiates between power, which deserves a denuding, indeed petrifying scrutiny, and people? So this is one of the questions that Dr. Leeb has posed, Professor Leeb, to us during our early emails. And she asked us, is it possible to decommodify through the collection form, though the collection form is the most dominant form under which so-called objects circulate? So I mean, my first thought about it was, well, what is already, the harm that's already been done is kind of, you cannot de-commodify what's already been commodified. That would be impossible. But it's not that other work cannot be done within that, but I'll just leave it at that for now, because I have quite a few other slides. So before we come to approach the question of how to go on, we must first address the various aspects of what has occurred through ethnographic collection. Here I cover only the main touch points of a system of artistic knowledge, economization, through a method of annotated citation. And so this is Jody Bird and et al. In a recent essay in Social Text, and they say, the relationship between ethnographic museological collection, cultural appropriation, and the capital of cultural knowledge, they describe it as economies of dispossession. By economies of dispossession, we mean those multiple and intertwined genealogies of racialized property, subjection, and expropriation through which capitalism and colonialism take shape historically and change over time. Economies in the plural here indicates both the economic as a particular kind of material fulcrum, a mode and relations of production, distribution, consumption, and reproduction, and all this entails. An economy as a specific systematic organization of logic or circuits of interaction and exchange. But this economy of expectation is likewise predicated upon the extraction, consumption, and disposal of other peoples and places, attributed discrepant value by logics of resources and racialization, and subordinated by the settler colonial desire for presence, habitation, and permanence. And think of that also in terms of property and collection as well. So, this is from Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Maybe some of you are more familiar with her work. Linda Tuhiwai Smith wrote a book on decolonial indigenous methodologies. She's of Maori descent. And she says here, it galls us that Western researchers and intellectuals can assume to know all that is possible to know of us on the basis of their brief encounters with some of us. It appalls us that the West can desire, extract, and claim ownership of our ways of knowing, our imagery, the things that we create and produce, and then simultaneously reject the people who created and developed those ideas and seek to deny them further opportunities to be creators of their own culture and own nations. So, Tuscarora scholar Jolene Rickard shares in her dissertation a bit of a story about what is called a burden strap, or the burden, which I'll show you in a moment. So she says here, at contact, in place of grass rope, my ancestors, the Tuscarora and Iroquois people, wove hundreds of tiny English cotton beads dotted with European-made glass seed beads to make straps that carried the burden. So this is an example from the Smithsonian Institution's website of a burden strap that was gifted by Pauline Johnson. And as described by Paula Whitlow about the burden strap, who is a relative of Pauline Johnson, she says, the burden strap, Gahasa, in Ganegahaga, the Mohawk language, is utilitarian, yet decorated to distinguish its nation and other affiliations. It is designed to rest along the hairline. Today, people use burden straps to portage canoes. When the Six Nations left New York State after the American Revolution, Pauline's paternal grandmother wrapped a silver communion service in rags and carried it the whole distance to Canada using a burden strap. One of the soldiers escorting the family actually speared through the bundle in a bid to get the old grandma to move faster. What I find interesting about the story of the burden strap is that not only was this grandmother carrying Pauline Johnson, the burden of a silver communion that was most likely gifted from probably the British Empire as a gift or symbol of trade between nations. this burden of having then the responsibility of when something is gifted to you to take that on, and to take on the responsibility to literally, physically carry it to one's next destination. And what happens now that actually she has gifted this back, this burden, to the Smithsonian Institution. So now this burden is placed upon the Smithsonian Institution to hold, which I find quite interesting. So David Garneau, Métis artist and scholar, talks a lot about the idea of the art of fake. He's one of quite a few different artists that use that term. So he says, one lesson while decolonization and indigenization is collective work, it sometimes requires occasions of separation, moments where indigenous people take space and time to work things out amongst ourselves. That was said in the film, which we also heard. The parallel moments when allies ought to do the same. That doesn't mean all the time, but there is moments when we have to go off and we have to do our own work, right? We have practices of that in queer community too, in trans community, where sometimes we have caucuses and we meet and we talk about what are our issues in community, right? So we can have more maybe advanced discussions about things sometimes in order to come back into community with something new that we share, right? So it's something I equate to kind of be similar to that practice. So we can, if I think about that further, we can also relate that to different wampums. One of the wampum that makes me think about that is the two-row wampum. So the two-row wampum depicts Ongwehonwe and Dutch colonial settlers traveling side by side on a river in separate vessels, parallel to each other, without one overtaking the other or without crossing each other's paths and disturbing each other's wakes. So I'll wrap it up. Okay, so this is an example of a university project where they reconstructed a project of a replica of a wampum in relationship to Professor Longboat's students. And as you can see here, this abstract form was also actually law. So this is treaty. And how it's oftentimes interpreted by people would be interpreted purely for aesthetic reasons and not understood as an artistic language of witnessing also and holding law. So it's a reminder also and in relationship with us, right? That we remember and we remain responsible for remembering law. Okay, so I will wrap it up with one more example. So this is the recent work of Manuel Chivage. He's a Guatemalan Mayan artist. And he has a series of works that he produced for the Centre Pompidou that encompassed contemporary traditional styles of pottery that are made out of plastic and sold within markets. And he worked together with he's a ceramicist as well as other practices, and he worked together with other Mayan potters to build a series of pottery that I think speaks to a different form of breaking through a linearity of time, which I think is quite an important part of our discussion, which we talked about the other day when we were sharing. So I leave that as a final image. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to, so we have heard another, thank you very much for sharing, and I'm sure, to me, a lot of this was not familiar, and I hope to you as well, or maybe not. So I would like to open directly for questions from the floor. And while you are thinking, I have a question to you. Could you maybe talk about, because you have, you work as a more, artistic research in this project, and then, but shifting to the question of legal questions. What are the limits also for you for the legal side, and in which way, or where do you see which is something more operative for you in different cases, or is it just two different strategies you're using which are next to each other and just playing completely different fields, or how do you translate between the legal and a project like this?
Yeah, it would be great to show another project so that question would become clearer. I guess you know, questions of legality are also questions of representation, appearance, visibility, right? And the way that violations can be seen and can be understood. So I guess this is the kind of connection that one could make in between those fields. And I guess it's also, let's say, interesting to notice that you know, law can be a place of intervention in itself, and because it somehow codifies culture, right? So Western relationship with what Western define as nature has been always under the sign of property, as you mentioned in your introduction. And that's a cultural relationship with the land, right? That's codified into law. So that's how it has always been defined and perceived. And I have a very early work, it's called Non-Human Rights, that does, which is a cultural work, so to speak, an artistic work, that does an investigation on the 2008 Constitution of Ecuador, where they introduce the rights of nature. And I lived in Ecuador for many, many years teaching there, and I was very much interested in the debates going around that. And while I was talking with one of the protagonists of that process that enshrine nature as a subject of law, as a subject of rights in the Constitution, she said to me, you know, there was a problem here, because the minute you say rights of nature and then you question, okay, we might think about what are those rights, but then we need to think what is nature. And, you know, we live in a kind of multicultural society, so to speak, and we think we all agree about what nature is, and that we have different cultures and one mono-nature that is there, you know, and under the Western epistemologies like property or a commodity and so on. And she said to me, like, but, you know, we don't have a proper definition of nature, and that's where the sort of, the side of struggle is, how we are going to, you know, reinvent. And I think the question of language, of how to name, you know, nature is of course also a very charted concept, and how, you know, through this law we can also invent or think about a different definition about what we thought it was nature. And that implies a rethink of relationships that is somehow codifying to law, but also how law has a kind of pedagogic dimension through which, you know, we can reconceive certain types of relationships. So, you know, if we imagine what is human rights, that's like 1948, and only now we are kind of trying to understand what's in fact is human rights, and it's a definition that's constantly being expanded and rethought. So the minute you pose something like, okay, nature is not a property anymore, it's a subject of law, what does it mean, and what does it mean for the very concept of nature? And I think that's a work of not only lawyers, but foremost a work of artists and cultural producers.